Thanks for joining, Jay.
Hey, it's good to be with you.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Thanks.
So today I wanted to talk about, we had you come to the ISI staff. You were talking about fundamental truths that conservatives should remember, keep in mind in a populist age.
Yeah.
And there's a few points that we touched on that I want to talk about. And I want to start with inflation.
Okay.
Because this is the main issue of this presidential election and campaign. And, if you're just observing from it, sort of as a normal American, I think the story is the federal government, started spending more money, with stimulus around COVID. That combined with supply chain shortages and other, large federal spending on other projects, and probably, monetary policy in the mix ended up helping to create this inflation crisis.
Yes.
I'm curious, is that your reading on the cause of inflation? Or because there are you'll talk to other people and they'll say, well, actually, no, the spending didn't have almost anything to do with inflation. So what do you make of that?
I don't get that. I mean, I do think, there's no doubt about the fact, look, we just shut down production during COVID, and the government borrowed money to kind of keep money somehow kind of moving around. We weren't adding, so more dollars chasing around a limited supply of goods and services. That's going to create inflation. That's not super complicated. But that should have been done. But what's continued to happen is massive deficit spending. The Fed's actually paranoid and has continued to for a while increase interest rates. But the amount of spending is just utterly staggering. Effectively what the federal government is doing is it's just borrowing from our near and distant future, right? It's, if you can imagine, the money's out there for our grandkids and bringing it here, right? Because, of course, they're inventing it from whole cloth, but because it has to be paid back, it is effectively borrowing it from the future. And so again, unless the economy is growing at the same rate as the amount that you're inflating the money supply, you're going to get inflation. And so I don't think that the inflation we experience is all that complicated or all that controversial. What's controversial is the politicians who are responsible for it wanting to deflect.
Sure.
So maybe a politician, for instance, proposing that the reason your groceries are more expensive is because, I don't know, the grocers all got greedy and decided to start price gouging or something like that. But so far as I know, grocery stores are not just swimming in profits. The reality is that inflation is almost entirely the result of specific government policy that may or may not have been well-meaning, but that's what this is the result of. There's no doubt in my mind.
And so, politicians, in both parties, claim they want to fix inflation.
Yes.
They plan to fix it, after this coming election. So my question is, what, obviously inflation has cooled a bit, but the prices, for certain things like groceries, like housing is still very hot, much higher, 20-30% than it was a few years ago. So are there actually any tools at the disposal of a politician or the government to actually tamp this down more quickly, or do you simply have to write it out?
Well, I suppose you could write it out, but stop doing the stuff that's causing the problem. We've all learned this statistic that we're borrowing about $1 trillion every 100 days, which is just completely insane. So if I'm not mistaken, we've now reached the point in which it is costing us more every year just on the service of the debt than we're spending on defense. Now, defense is like the first job of the federal government, right, is defense. And yet we're spending more just paying the interest on the debt. That's just completely insane. And so it's not obvious to me what incentive there is, unfortunately, in either party to stop this spending. That's the reason that it's happening. In some ways, until the pain is intense enough and enough of the electorate recognizes that the pain is the result of these policies, I don't know that the elected officials will have the incentive to actually do something different. That's always the dilemma, isn't it? That politicians, they know they're doing the wrong thing. They know it leads to long-term disaster. But if the electorate ultimately sort of approves it and votes for them for doing it, you're going to keep getting that, unfortunately.
So shifting to tax policy.
Yes.
I'm curious because I think it makes sense to me that generally having lower taxes is better for companies. It's, makes them more competitive, especially with, competition in other nations.
Yep.
Lighter regulations, getting rid of cumbersome kind of excessive regulations that hold businesses back. That all makes a lot of sense to me. I'm curious though, with tax cuts, at what cost are they worthwhile? So would you say a deficit funded tax cut? So I can imagine a scenario maybe coming out of the Carter years, or when tax rates are super high. But you cut taxes, and then the growth, the supply side makes it up, right?
Right.
Is that always true? And are tax cuts still good even if you're adding several trillion to the deficit?
Right.
Will growth make it up? How do you see that?
And so I'd say, it is an abstract question. Cutting taxes and borrowing money from other people is bad. I want to come out officially opposed to that. The question is, okay, are you at a state where the income tax rates are so high that you're going to get this kind of supply side effect? And so, of course, this is the famous Laffer curve. The idea of the Laffer curve is not that. The basic idea is that, you're not going to reach maximum tax revenues if you tax everybody at 100%, because nobody works, right? But of course, at zero, you're not going to get any tax revenues either. The idea is that there's a sweet spot in which the government will maximize its revenues, but the sweet spot is as much as they can tax without sort of suppressing economic growth. And so if that's true, there's going to be this point. Let's say it's 22% to simplify it. So in other words, if you're above 22%, you cut taxes to 22%, you can actually increase revenues because of the economic growth that's a result of that. If you're at or below 22%, that would imply that you cut taxes, you're just growing the deficit. And I think that's a terrible idea. Now, economists will generally argue that, okay, well, if you're going to balance the budget, at least balance it over the business cycle. So in other words, what that means is that it might be worth it. Let's say you're in a recession and you want to kind of prime the economy. And so you do a little deficit spending, even if it's inflationary, increases the deficit, but then you need to balance it when the economy has gotten back to where it should be. That's the idea. And so the net is that you have a balanced budget, but you don't balance it right then. Now the problem is that because I think we don't have a law in place that requires that.
Sure.
It's very hard to see how you get democratically elected representatives to ever obey that, because the reality is, in theory, if the economy is growing at any rate, you just freeze spending, maybe freeze it at the rate of inflation or something like that. You're eventually going to get rid of the deficit. But we do not do that because we're unfortunately in this kind of binge cycle where it's not in any politician's interest to actually do that. I mean, there's just massive constituencies that are involved. It's easy to hide the effects of inflation. I think what is significant about the last few years is that the average American now recognizes inflation for what it is. Inflation is not when there's high demand for housing in a neighborhood and the price goes up.
Sure.
That's just supply and demand. Inflation is essentially when the value of your currency, a dollar in this case, is less and less valuable.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's what's happening. And it's happening not just in these places where the government has been way too involved, higher education and healthcare and housing, right? But in just really basic foodstuffs and things like that, which that tells you that, okay, we're dealing with a kind of systemic inflation, which is what suggests that, okay, it must have a universal cause, which is this degradation of the value of the dollar, which is what happens when you artificially inflate the supply of money.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me. Less clear how we get out of this crisis.
Yes, exactly. That's the tough question.
So one of the things I took away from your talk is that, the fundamental assumptions of, free market economics are true, in an objective sense. But there are certain circumstances, sometimes it might be national security related, sometimes it might be cultural, where the most efficient economic outcome is not always the best for the nation state or the community.
Yeah.
And so then you have to kind of weigh,
That's right.
Weigh the choices. I'm curious on something like, let's start with trade.
Yes.
And obviously you had, a point you raised on is sort of, our approach to, we didn't have a total free trade regime with the Soviet Union.
That's right.
With China, especially in their more recent kind of predatory form. We will have to, from various reasons, perhaps with certain national security issues, have to make exceptions to the kind of the free trade principle. But I guess one question I have is, so the national security kind of exception is pretty obvious, I think. At least as relates to particular things that are truly vitally essential, military supplies, right?
Yeah, things like that. And of course, everyone tries to claim everything is national security. So I think it can be waxed. No,
if you want to persuade conservatives of using the power of the government, wrap it in national security.
Sugar subsidy is absolutely crucial to our national security.
But okay, so the national security exception, if it's sort of more narrowly understood, I think is clear. But then I think you kind of quickly get into this realm where there's so many other things that are connected. So it's like, or not unrelated, but seem somewhat essential, like pharmaceuticals or telecommunications or energy supplies or rare earth minerals. I guess that spans energy and tech and national security.
Absolutely.
So all of a sudden you kind of get into I think you find yourself in a somewhat messy world, right? Where you have to say, if we're trading oranges from Florida for sugar from Cuba or wherever, like who cares if it's free, but you immediately, all of a sudden it feels as though the exceptions almost become the rule, because then you have a sort of a de facto industrial policy.
That's right.
Listed these key vital industries.
That's right.
That with some of them, we probably need them to be in the U.S. proper. With others, it's probably fine if a friendly ally has them. But then you have the question of, well, how repatriate or cultivate, and then basically you could use tariffs, you could, which is a blunt instrument. You could use subsidies. Maybe there's a few other levers that you can pull. So I guess the question is, as someone who has a bias for free trade, from an efficiency standpoint, are all of these exceptions in the way that you have to prudently navigate them? Is that an industrial policy in itself, or not? Really?
I don't think so. I mean, the general policy I think that the U.S. needs to pursue. Now, we're not realistically going to completely disentangle from China, because we just simply can't. It's depressing, but it's true. But chip manufacturing in particular, we've got Taiwan, which of course China claims is theirs. A vast majority of the advanced microprocessing is manufactured in Taiwan.
That's right.
They have massive manufacturing. Foxconn, those are facilities in mainland China, but it's a Taiwanese company. The technology that Taiwan is using is almost entirely American and European and Israeli. That's, by the way, our insurance policy, because if China were to invade Taiwan and take over, they'd never get another software upgrade and all that equipment that they just stole. So that we're just enmeshed in a way that I think is going to be difficult to disentangle. I think the general policy should be that we, as a country, stop looking at China as a potential future liberal democracy, which is what we were kind of hoping for in the 90s, and understand that they are our global adversary. And they're the global adversary to anyone that wants a kind of free and prosperous country, and just understand China that way. But so that means that we should be willing to pay a lot in terms of increased prices. Because I wouldn't talk about efficiency. I just, everything is more expensive and all of us are a little bit poorer. That's the way to think of it. But we're protecting ourselves long-term from empowering China. And then what we need to do is actually develop trade relations with all the other countries that are our allies. So, and then you don't have to constantly be deciding, okay, which thing are we going to apply tariffs to? You just focus on China. And so I think it makes perfect sense that we do things that frankly make us less dependent on China and make it harmful for China, make them pay an economic cost for their behavior. But let's build the biggest free trade zone that we possibly can with real allies, genuine allies that have our interests in mind. That's the way I would think of it. And then you're just saying, look, we're just going to pay a price here in terms of disentangling as much as we can with China. But that seems to make sense. And then the hope would be that maybe 20 years from now, the Beijing will realize, wow, the Americans were willing to do that even at a cost to themselves. Maybe this was a bad policy. I think that's the greatest thing we could have.
Or perhaps some of the contradictions in the Chinese economy will end up coming to, the bill for that will come.
Absolutely. And I generally don't believe any of the statistics coming out of China anyway. And I've been to China and I've seen some of the strange kind of developments in which they build entire sections of cities that are unoccupied. We know there's massive demographic collapse there. I suspect that, yes, China is a big country. It's the hegemon. But I suspect that some of that is sort of paper tiger stuff, just as we saw with the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, the former Soviet Union. So last question for you, shifting to immigration.
Yes.
I'm curious the relationship between, so I'm trying to unpack this, but technological innovation and in low skill mass immigration. So, you could, if you have mass immigration, legal or illegal, you could employ people at a fast food restaurant for much lower, right? And the cost of your food is going to be lower. And basically because the labor is so cheap, the cost of implementing, let's say, new technologies to innovate in a fast food, it doesn't make sense because the labor is so
That's
cheap.
right.
If you were to restrict the flow of mass immigration, all of a sudden, basically you would need the fast food restaurant will need to pay their workers more.
That's right.
Because there's fewer workers, right?
That's right.
And so at some point they're going to realize, well, we can't make this work. So they're going to perhaps, I don't know, maybe they make an investment, maybe they find a way to innovate. They automate.
Yeah, you think McDonald's is a perfect example that you notice in some cities that have sort of restrictive wage situations like California. You see a heck of a lot of those kiosks, right? And a lot fewer people working. I suspect that's what you would see, at least in some places, like fast foods. You're not going to automate the housekeepers in the hotels.
Sure.
That's going to, and so then the question is, how much kind of substituting is actually happening if we were extremely restrictive on low skill immigration? Because of course, right now what we have is a good bit of legal low skill immigration, and then just a huge amount of illegal immigration, which is unconscionable. And so at the moment, we're not even dealing with that.
Yeah.
But even if we were dealing with that properly, there is a question, okay, so what's the kind of ideal amount, or is there an ideal amount of a kind of immigration flow?
Yeah.
And I think it's going to differ for every country, but a lot of it has to do with cultural cohesion. Are you able to transmit culture? Do you get accused of being racist and jingoist and colonialist if you want people to come here to be Americans, right? Or not?
Yeah.
We're really bad at that. And so I think that's part of why immigration ends up feeling very much like it's a net loss or a cost to us rather than benefit. It's precisely because, now sometimes we get people that are delighted to be here. I talk to them when I drive by and take Uber. But very often you might get someone that comes from another country. They sign up for a local community college, and 6 months later they're radicalized against the country. This is just completely insane. And so I think it's perfectly rational that we take a look not just at the flow of illegal immigration, but immigration policy as a whole. While I would never say that long-term increasing the amount of labor, that's not going to, over the long term, if the economy grows at all, that's not going to lead to everyone being poorer, because people that work are also producing value.
Sure.
They're also consumers. And so that's why the country can be much larger than it was 200 years ago, and yet everyone's better off. Because more wealth's being created.
And so, but just, I think a lot that makes sense to me on this point of innovation, though, because it appears that you could make the case that with high skill immigration, there could be a benefit for innovation,
right.
Whereas potentially with low skill immigration at a certain number, it actually hinders innovation.
Yeah, it's going to certainly hinder. I would assuming let's just assume that if there was no low skill immigrants coming in, right, that the average domestic American is going to be paid more, right? But then McDonald's or someone's going to have to say, gosh, our business model won't work then, right, at that price point. And so they're going to be much more likely to automate. So insofar as that kind of innovation, we might be suppressing it at that level. At the higher level, the people that are going to create the machine learning programs and the robots that are going to automate factories and create radically new kinds of products and wealth, they're generally in short supply. I mean, any tech company can tell you that. And so they generally want to have a kind of free flow of people with that skill. Now, part of the lesson, if that frustrates you, is, we need to be training more folks like that. But the reality is, if imagine there's 12 people on the planet and they're randomly distributed, right, that have these skills that allow us to make the next click, So for instance, making certain rare earth minerals that China has a control on obsolete, right? And they're randomly distributed. Which countries are going to be more likely to end up with them in their labor force? So it's going to be countries that have a way to let them in, right? And so if we literally had an immigration policy where no one comes in, in the long run, we're going to lose because there's competition for those types of people. And so that's why I think a rational immigration policy is going to take those kinds of things into account, but is also going to take into account the need for a cohesive culture. And so if more people are coming into your country than you can assimilate and make good Americans, there are too many people coming into your country. I think that's perfectly straightforward. And so that means, how many people do you want in your country, and what do we need to do to make sure that there's a pipeline, right, so that people become faithful and loyal citizens.
So to close, you shared a quote from Thomas Sowell that I think is very apropos, especially during an election cycle. I'm wondering if you could maybe summarize that for
Absolutely. It's just, let me say that this basically, the first lesson of economics is scarcity. There's never enough stuff to go around. The first lesson of politics is to ignore the first lesson of economics, because politicians often have incentives to advocate policies that actually harm the very people that may think they're a good idea. And so that's what I think it calls in a republic, calls for us to cultivate and rewards true statesmen that can be leaders, that can make a case for a vision that maybe a majority of people initially thought was a bad idea, but actually in the long run will help Americans be able to prosper and flourish.
Great. We'll close there. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you, Johnny.